We are just going to give everyone a moment or two to connect in our Zoom room. We've got a couple hundred people registered for today's conversation. We want to make sure everyone's had the opportunity to connect and doesn't miss out on any of it before we get started. So give us just a second. All right, we are going to get started in just one more minute. I see a couple of people still connecting, and then we will get started. All right, I think most people are in, a couple of stragglers, but we'll go ahead and get today's conversation started as we like to be prompt with our time. So welcome everyone. My name is Jennifer Thompson. I'm the Executive Director of NASW New Jersey, and we are so excited that you're here today to join us for this important conversation led by our friend and social worker, Pat Spencer. She is an LCSW and just a treasure of information, particularly when it comes to parenting. Today's conversation is about how we talk to our children regarding the events of last week, the insurrection of our government, and really to give parents tools and tips on how to navigate these complicated conversations. We do have a couple hundred people registered and joining today's Zoom call from all over the country, as many of our community conversations do. Today we're here to talk about the realities of the situation, the realities that our nation is facing, and how we talk about that. This isn't a conversation for debate, but really about the tools that we can give to parents in the short amount of time that we have today. There are a lot of ways that you can interact. We want you to ask questions. We want you to engage with us and get your questions answered. You can do so a couple of different ways. You can raise your Zoom hand if you're familiar with that function. I think a lot of us are now. Or if you have questions, you can type them in the chat box and we'll answer those as well. We will try, as time permits, to call a couple of people live so that we can see your faces and interact with you. So if you want to turn your cameras on, we always appreciate being able to see people. And then if you have questions but you're not comfortable asking them in the chat room or raising your hands, you can also message those to me privately and I will ask them on your behalf. So with that said, we do have a lot of people watching on Facebook. So if you have questions, you can also add them in the comment section on Facebook. We do have team members who are monitoring that as well and will let us know what some of those questions are. So with those housekeeping items underway, we will turn this now over to Pat Spencer. Thank you so much, Pat, for joining us and leading today's conversation. I'm particularly excited about it as a mom and a mom who doesn't know how to navigate this. So I'm looking for your pearls of wisdom.
Thank you. Thank you and good morning, everybody. As Jen said, my name is Pat Spencer. I am an LCSW or a licensed clinical social worker. I am a therapist in Highland Park, New Jersey, so smack dab in the middle of the state. And like many of you, last week on Wednesday, we kind of watched our country unravel a little bit. We watched in live time the insurrection that occurred at the Capitol. And many people were left with questions. How do I internalize this? How do I make sense of what's happening? How do I make sense of what's happening for myself? But also, how do I make sense of what's happening for the children in my life? Whether the children in your life be your actual children as a parent, or the children in your life as your niece and nephews, or perhaps a neighbor. Maybe you're a teacher working with children. Maybe you're like me, a therapist working with kids. So how do we help the kids make sense of all of this? And how do we also make sense of all of that's going on? I would be remiss if not to really acknowledge that this is not the only crisis happening in our country right now. The events that unfolded last week on January 6th, they occur simultaneously as a global pandemic. They're occurring simultaneously as children are being homeschooled. They're occurring simultaneously as parents and grandparents and others are facing, COVID. Good morning. And, so it's not just what occurred on January 6th that we're having to deal with. the children that are in our lives, and quite honestly ourselves, our cup is already full of anxiety. Our bodies are already overwhelmed. We're already filled with cortisol. Every day is a new thing kind of facing us. So when we want to talk with our kids about difficult situations, whether this difficult situation be this insurrection that occurred, or a difficult situation be the pandemic, or perhaps school shootings, perhaps violence in neighborhoods, we have some similar tools that we want to use and some similar themes that we want to make sure we're mindful of. So when we are working or living or being with children, their questions often revolve around two big themes, but those two big themes are kind of broken up. The two themes primarily are, am I safe? And is life going to go on in the way I know it? Are things going to remain predictable? And predictability does lead to safety. So if you really want to look at it, it's really just one big theme of safety. So with kids and kids of all ages, I am somebody's child, granted an old child, but I am somebody's child. So kids of all ages, we have questions of, am I safe? When we're working with our children, we want to be able to help answer that question of, am I safe? How can I stay safe? What does safety look like? The next big theme that we're going to be looking at is, are the people that are taking care of me safe? So a child first, it's very egocentric. It's very, what's happening inside of me? Am I safe? And then they're going to look to outside. And for those of you that have small children or know small children, you know that one of the first things that a small child does, like a toddler does, if they're in an unfamiliar situation, they're looking for mom and dad. They're looking for a familiar face. And what they want to see in that familiar face is safety and comfort and predictability. And then the third thing that they're looking at is, how are things going to impact my daily life? So thankfully, the insurrection that occurred is not necessarily impacting their daily life right now. It was horrible events that we saw on the TV, but the daily life that's occurring in New Jersey or Washington State or Florida or Wyoming is all pretty similar. Now, the kids that are living in DC and maybe that DC metro area, things might be a little different because roads are shut down and they're seeing more and more of a presence of maybe police and whatnot. So the kids are going to want to know is, how are these things going to impact my daily life? So now how we address these things with the children and with the kids is going to depend on their chronological age and their developmental age. So what you're going to say to a 2-year-old is going to be vastly different than what you're going to say to a 7-year-old. And what you say to a 7-year-old is going to be vastly different than the conversation you're going to have with a 15-year-old. So it's vitally important to realize and to recognize where they are. And in order to have these conversations, because these kids are going to want to have a conversation. So a conversation is a two-way conversation. It's not a lecture. Like right now, quite honestly, I'm lecturing most of you. I would prefer a two-way conversation. If we were in person, we could do this, but pandemic. But we're going to make do with what we can. So please do write comments and stuff. But so we do want to have a conversation with our children. Now, the first thing that we want to do is actually check in first with ourselves. I cannot have a conversation with somebody if I myself am not regulated. So as I just mentioned, the kids oftentimes look to their caregivers for, am I safe or am I not safe? So if we are dysregulated, if we are filled with anxiety, we need to just check in and see, what do we need to do to kind of help bring that anxiety level down? Because what you may have noticed in your lives is that anxiety is contagious. Actually, a lot of emotions are contagious. For those of you that like sports, just think of what it's like going to a sporting competition. I happen to love football, and I love going to football games. And I can tell you that it's very easy to get caught up in the exuberance of the stadium when everybody's yelling and screaming and cheering. It's like all of a sudden I'm yelling, screaming, and cheering. So our emotions can be contagious. So again, as the adult in their room, the first thing I'm gonna do is check in. How am I feeling? Am I able to have this conversation right now? What do I need to do to kind of help regulate myself? And this is where things like, deep breathing, exercise, good nutrition, community connection. Oh my goodness, connection is so vitally important. That's the one thing that we've greatly lost during this pandemic is connection. But so we want to check in, how do we keep ourselves as regulated as possible? Now with that, and this is where I want to kind of contradict myself almost immediately, which is we also want to help the kids recognize that we are also having feelings. Because one of our roles as an adult is to help kids put words to what they're feeling inside. Because if you think of children as they grow up, oftentimes the very first thing that starts off is all somatic, all physiological. A 2-year-old has a temper tantrum because they don't really know how to express that they really want that toy over there, and that they're very sad and disappointed that they don't have it. So we have to help them put words to it. So as our kids are getting older, we're able to help them put words to it. So even now as an adult, you as a mom or a dad, and quite honestly, I'm looking at Jen, so I kind of keep thinking of mom, but it's like, so, as a mom, it's going to be, telling your child, baby, what I saw on TV yesterday, that was scary. So acknowledging that feeling, because we don't want them to think that their feelings are something to be ashamed of. We want to be able to join with them at some level. But we want to have that conversation when we are regulated. So yes, baby, that what we saw on TV was scary. Mom and dad were also very scared at what we saw and very, sad. But I'm wondering what you're feeling and what you're thinking. So go into this conversation. One of the first things we want to do after checking in with ourselves is checking in with the child. Checking in with what are their thoughts, what are their feelings, like their physical feelings, but also their emotional feelings. And then also, what are they worried about and what are they concerned about? Because what somebody's going to be worried and concerned about, again, at age 5 is going to be very different than what they're worried and concerned about at age 15. If you think about a 5-year-old, they're going to be worried about, are those people coming to our house? Are those people coming to my school? Are those people coming to our neighborhood? Hopefully the answer is no. Hopefully you're able to say that to them. Versus a 15-year-old, their worry might be, well, as part of our First Amendment rights, we have a right to free speech. So how do we then stand up and be able to protest, but to protest safely? How do we make sure our democracy still stands? Because at age 15, they're learning US history, they're learning government, they're learning all that. And now it's actually real in their face. So how can we help them understand what they're seeing and feeling? So again, we want to create that safe space for them. We want to be able to listen to their thoughts, to listen to their feelings, and to listen to their concerns. Now, one of our bigger tricks is that we want to also have this conversation so that we can help bring them to a place where they can actually have this conversation. And this is where how emotions are contagious is really quite a powerful thing. So as a therapist, what I often do is we kind of match somebody's emotion and then bring them to a place where they can actually be aware of what's happening around them and what's happening in them. So I want to join with somebody. Yes, it is very scary. What we saw was terrifying, was sad. The more we read about it, quite honestly, the more I read about it, the worse it gets. But yet I don't want to have me at a level 10 when I'm having that conversation with somebody. So if I'm having a conversation with somebody and they're at level 10, I want to kind of go up to like a level 5 and then help them come down a little bit. So now they can actually process and integrate that information. So some of the concerns and questions that might be coming up for kids. And again, depending on their developmental levels and their age levels and also their interests, it could be, well, grandpa has signs in his front yard that look just like the signs I saw on January 6th. So now we're having to sit and help our kids figure out what happens if, how do we integrate what a family member might believe versus what they saw on TV? How do we help kids face that conflict? And that's a really big question. And quite honestly, I don't necessarily have an answer to how do we face that. I think that's a larger question within the family to have a discussion with. And if I had a family I was doing a family session with, that would be a big part of what we discuss. But it's how do we help somebody recognize that there can be different points of views and to help these kids feel safe. Because again, it all has to go back to safety. And I'm really trying hard not to be political. But it's really hard because, like, again, if you see something, if a kid is watching TV and they see a lot of the rioters were carrying signs that said, you know, Trump is my president, that type of stuff. And then they drive around their neighborhood and they see the same signs in their neighborhood. How do we help them integrate that information? And again, this all goes back to that conversation of, in our house, we are doing what we can to keep you safe. Our home is a safe space. And hopefully that is true. Hopefully your home is a safe space. Hopefully the homes of the kids you're working with are safe spaces. You know, so I'm just curious, what are people seeing with their kids, whether it be their kids as a school counselor or their kids as their actual children? If you could either chat in or something, just let me know what you're seeing.
I think that's great. I think one of the things you hit directly on the head is like what they're seeing in their own communities and the fear that they're seeing on TV, right? So you drive around town and you see a bunch of the signs that are directly related to what they saw on TV, and that's a big question mark. Is this safe? Is my community safe? Is it okay? Is this going to happen here? Because the imagery is identical. I think the other thing, and a real challenge for kids, and I think it starts at a very young age, because we are still in the midst of a global pandemic, but still in the middle of a racial crisis within our nation, is the language on TV is about the difference in how the people last week are being treated differently than protesters. And if they had been Black and brown, how this experience would have been very different. So I think it's not only a political discussion, but a safety discussion, but then also a matter of race. And that all coming together is a very difficult one to navigate with children, or at least for me it is.
Right. Yeah, no, it is incredibly difficult to navigate this. And again, depending on the age of the child, I work an awful lot with adolescents. I have a good portion of my practice is 12 to 15-year-old kids. And so a technique that I use with them is these concentric circles. So real quick, see if I can draw something and see if you can even see it. You might not, but I'm a very fancy artist here. You're going to see very shortly. I draw circles. Can you see that? Like the inside circle, then it goes out. So
Yep.
what I do with the child is I focus first on that inside circle. That inside circle is the people that are closest to them. So the first thing I'm going to be talking about is, what is safety in our family? How do you feel here? How can I make that inside circle like just as strong of a place as possible? And then that next circle out might be their friends, let's say, or extended family. And then the next circle might be school. And then the next circle might be community, and kind of building out from there. And what I want to try to do with the child is help them see that those inside circles are as strong as possible, are as safe as possible. And then if we can have that be as safe as possible, we can withstand whatever's happening in the outside. And then on the very outside, not even the circles, but on the outside, it's just like, who are your neighbors? What's happening down the street? What's happening in Washington, D.C.? What's happening in Seattle, Washington? And let them see that really the place that's going to have the most impact on them are those inside circles. So that's where I'm really trying to build that safety. And so in the context of racial, the racial violence, or I'm sorry, the tensions, the protests and whatnot that we've had, the insurrection, the questions I saw somebody chat in, like, how do we answer a question of, hey, at Black Lives Matters protest, people got arrested for doing nothing. But yet at the insurrection, we got people storming the Capitol and not getting arrested in that moment. How do we help them make sense of it? And to be honest with you, I don't think we can help them make sense of it because it does not make sense. The only thing I can tell them is I don't fully understand all that's going on. We have different rules for different people, apparently. And again, I'm going to go back to my inside circle. So when I'm working with a child, I want that child to feel as safe as possible. Now, an older child, as we're drawing this out, I might help them see how can they have impact on these other places. So if you think about the shootings that took place at Parkland High School down in Coral Springs, Florida, oh goodness, I think that was 3 years ago. One, not that I ever want something, not that I'm saying something good came of it, but something that came of that was the students there were advocates for themselves. And they've been big proponents of like gun legislation and really trying to make a change. And so if I'm working with a teenager and they're coming up with these questions of why are these rioters at the Capitol getting treated than the protesters at Black Lives Matters marches, I might try to see if I can help them get involved in the community, maybe in the Black Lives Matter movement, maybe in politics, maybe in kind of making sure their voice is heard. Because one thing we want to try to do, part of safety is also kind of being empowered. So as the kids are getting older, I'm going to try to help them figure out how can they have their voice heard. Because one of the things that's happening with this insurrection that occurred is that people feel powerless. And so how can we get that power back? Now, a whole nother part of the conversation I'm going to be having with kids, and again, kids of all ages, is to recognize the bad things that we've gone through in our lives before. Because in order to have resilience, and resilience is kind of like that been the key word for the past 5 or 6 years in my field, in order to build resilience, you have to have faced bad things. So something I'm going to be talking about and, kind of helping the kids identify are what are some bad things that we've overcome? What are some bad things we faced? And hopefully, they haven't been huge bad things. Maybe it could be, do you remember the time that, I don't know, you failed a class in school, but then the next year you came back and did really well. Remember last year when grandma was really sick and how scary that was? Remember, so building on whatever these negative challenges are that we've had in our lives, helping the kids find out that they've come through it. And then applying it to this of, hey, listen, this is going to be hard. But things are going, we are together as a family, as a unit. We're going to get through it as much as possible. With that said, though, you also don't want to lie to a child. Because if you lie, they're going to find out. And now they can't necessarily trust. So saying, I don't know is a perfectly fine answer. Saying, I don't know what's going to happen on January 20th, because to be honest with you, I am a little worried about what's going to happen next week at the inauguration. I'd be lying to you if I didn't say that, but I can tell a kid, I'm also worried about that. However, I also believe that there's a lot of really good people that are trying to do the right thing. And that together we can get through whatever happens to be thrown our way. So that's kind of how I'm going to phrase it to the child.
We have that conversation a lot, and what are we looking out for next, right? That's on the news, and in our household, we have the news on quite a bit in the evening. Got to catch up with what you're going to be doing the next day in our field, right? But we also talk about the idea of we don't know what's going to happen, but we know what we can control, right? We know that we are going to stay home. We are going to stay safe. We are going, we're in virtual school for better or for worse, right? So our little inner circle can be safe, and that's what we're going to focus on.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and that goes back to the predictability. We want things to be as predictable as possible for the kids. And 2020 was nothing if not unpredictable. And 2021, I don't know about you guys, but I was like on January 1st, I was like, that's it. We're turning into a new year. We got the vaccine going. You know, I actually got vaccinated. This is awesome. Woo! Yay! I started planning vacations. And then there was an insurrection. And I was like, oh, good Lord. You know, and so if I, as a pretty, you know, intelligent, well-supported, well-connected person was feeling kind of that, imagine what a kid is feeling. And Jen, something you just said also reminded me of our 24-hour news cycle. For those of you that are old enough to remember, we used to not have a 24-hour news cycle. I see a few people nodding and I see a few people going, what? You know, this is where I sound like Sophia from the Golden Girls. You know, picture it, Burlington, New Jersey, 1984. We didn't have CNN, period. Like we watched the news, but it was only for 1 hour. We had the local news and then we had the national news and then we watched Jeopardy. Now it's 24/7. And there was some, especially for smaller kids, there was some research that showed that after 9/11, when kids would see the planes hitting the towers, they thought it was happening over and over and over and over and over again. They didn't recognize that it was separate events. Now, our brains take in information in very unique ways. So when we see that insurrection over and over and over and over again, it's kind of reinforcing that sense of danger. So one of the biggest things we can do for our kids is to turn off the TV or to turn off the computer, or to set up times to talk to the kids about the news, but to have it be set times. But then to please make sure we're building in other things in our lives. And those other things in our lives has been particularly challenging during the pandemic. It was a little easier during the pandemic in the summer because we could go out, but now we're in the pandemic in the winter, and so it's harder to go out again. But how can we build in other things? How can we keep a sense of normalcy in our lives? Whether that normalcy be going to school or being homeschooled. You know, how do we help our kids stay connected with their friends, which has been incredibly difficult? How do we help our kids stay connected to grandparents, which only recently have some of them started having contact again after a year? And as many of you may know, grandparents are absolutely key in raising children, whether the grandparents be far away or close. You know, grandparents really can be a strong support at times. So how can we continue the sense of normalcy, or how can we actually find it again? Because one of our problems is that in 2020, we lost our sense of normalcy. And now we're faced with this huge crisis and we're trying to find normalcy at the same time. So it's I'm gonna use a very clinical term, so please don't get lost in this. It's a hot mess. It's an absolute hot mess right now. But again, the key is going back to that circle. How can we keep our inner circle as normal as possible? How can we keep, even if you're homeschooling, how do you have dinner at the same time that you normally would? How do you have waking up for school at the same time? How do you, I even encourage people, I know the joke is that in 2020, we all wore pajamas all day, every day. I had my work pajamas and my sleep pajamas. But how do we have some sense of normalcy? And I actually recommend that people get dressed, like in regular clothes, you know, for a certain period of time. I'm not at home, I'm in my office simply because this is where I work. Never mind that I'm doing all telehealth. So again, the sense of normalcy, how can we help our kids have that sense of normalcy?
There are a couple of questions that have come in, and someone asked how we can start to address this with parents, particularly in education, who might not see this as a racial issue, but also don't want for the children to be engaged in this conversation because they think it's political or whatnot. Any thoughts on that?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. So if we're talking about in education, so kind of how do, as teachers, what are they going to address, or as school social workers or school counselors? I don't necessarily have a straight answer, but I'm going to go back to, we're going to address what the kids bring to us. If a child comes in and says, I saw the news and mom and dad won't talk about it, then it might be up to the teacher just to give a few facts, and I do mean facts, which January 6th, a group of people were not happy that President Trump was not reelected, went to the Capitol building, broke into the Capitol building. It was scary for everybody, and now there are consequences coming down. That's pretty cut and dry as to what happened. I don't see a lot of room for interpretation in there. So I'd probably leave it at that, and then have the, suggest the child go back to their parents. As a therapist, I'm in a little bit of a different situation, because if a child comes into my office, I have a, agreement with the parents that it's confidential in here, they can talk what they want to. But again, we're letting the child lead the conversation. So if a child says, mom and dad, mom and dad went to the events at the Capitol. My conversation with them would be focused around what is the child's view of that. All right, so your parents went to that last Wednesday. Tell me, what are your thoughts? What are your reactions on it? Because I am certainly not going to be sitting there telling a child that their parents are bad. But I am going to be focusing on, what are your thoughts? What are your reactions? What do you think happened? And not really getting into any more of the nitty gritty with that. Because again, a kid does need to go home. And I, for one, am not going to be telling a child that what their parents did was wrong. Even if I believe that what their parents did was wrong, I'm following the child's lead. What are your thoughts on it? If the kid comes to me and says, I'm really disappointed that mom and dad went, okay, talk to me about that. What disappoints you about it? What are your thoughts on it? So again, I'm letting the kid lead that conversation. Now, if I'm in a school setting and a child comes in and starts in the classroom and is like, yeah, what happened on January 6th? Yoo-hoo, yay. As a teacher, I'm going to kind of squash that. Hey, let's sit down. We're focused on math here. We're not focused on what happened over there. And then I'm going to check in with the school policies and kind of pass the buck up to my principal and find out what are the policies about this and how is the school addressing this? Because there are larger issues. So yeah, and not necessarily the best answer, but it's the one I have.
Well, it's so hard right now. There aren't any perfect answers in these situations because we are all facing this for the first time as well and muddling through literally a year of crisis after crisis. And that makes it really difficult to even just get your bearings, right? And like, no, I jokingly said, when we watched this in our household, my first reaction was not appropriate at all. But I was just riding along, looking forward to like 21 with a virus, vaccine, and we're going to be good. And then I thought, and I had a great day. That morning, we were talking about the transition, and social workers are going to be on the front lines. Our voices are going to be heard. And then I got in the car and my husband called and I was like, well, that was not how I thought today was going to go. So my reaction was terrible. And one of the things I've seen a lot in the schools right now, my own sons included, is that we're also preparing for Martin Luther King Day, right? Mm-hmm. And using this moment and his advocacy as a way to talk about how it can and what peaceful advocacy looks like, and contrast that for particularly little kids, because it's something that they're seeing and they're talking about and they do every year. And how did they look different? Why were they treated different? And it's been a really great way. Thank goodness for the teachers and school social workers who have brought those tools up, because that was a really great way for our kids to look at it.
Yeah.
I'm curious, for those who are in the chat room, is there anyone who wants to raise their hand, has questions? I saw someone raise it a little bit ago, but then took it down. We'd love to hear your questions.
And I see a lot of great comments. Like Lisa wrote, there's such a thing as universal rights and wrongs. Murder is wrong. Couldn't agree more. Threats are wrong. Right on. Insurrection is wrong. Yep. Sorry, somebody chatted and I lost my place. But either way, Lisa said some good stuff here. Murder is wrong. Voting is right. Yes. Respecting vote results is right. Legally airing your grievances is right. Peace is right. Yes, well said, Lisa. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, excellent.
There's a question that came in, just your thoughts on it. If talking about these issues, and particularly political climate, if there's an age of which it's too young to talk about it, not necessarily around safety, but talking about the politics piece of it.
I don't necessarily have like an age where I would say, yes, this is the right time to talk about politics versus not. But it's always about safety, and it's also about what they're seeing. You know, so if I happen to have grown up in a family where we watched the news every night together. Like that was just part of our tradition. And so I remember watching the news from a really young age. So if you're showing, if the little kids are watching the news with you, they're getting that information. So if they're getting the information, we need to have some type of conversation about that information. So if you think they're too young to know about politics, they might be too young for the news. The challenge is that our news is everywhere. The same technology that's allowing us all to be together today is the same technology that's allowing access to information. So we want to, again, focus on what their developmental level is. I might not necessarily have a conversation about QAnon and Republicans and Democrats and socialism. That might not be the focus of my conversation to a 5-year-old. That conversation might be, hey, some people have different points of view. We have to look at where their information is coming from. Some of them, their points of view are backed by facts, some of them are not, and kind of helping them work through that. The other thing is that kids, especially, well, goodness, at all ages, they have access right now to social media, it seems. But like kind of age 12 and up seems to be the largest area where they really are involved in social media, and they understand memes and they understand TikTok and they understand all that good stuff. So if they're on that, we need to have a conversation about how does that information get put out there? And something I work with the kids that I work with is kind of how do we then validate what they see? So, because I don't know if anybody know this, but just because it's on the internet does not mean it's true. It's a little secret I try to tell the kids, that the World Wide Web is not equal to truth. So yesterday there was a meme actually that went around, and I was like, this can't be true. This absolutely is false. And I checked it out and it was true. It was about the guy with the horns. He's in jail in Arizona and he's been refusing to eat since Friday, and he's refusing to eat because they won't serve him organic food. And I saw that as a meme and I was like, oh my God, this is absolutely false. And this is why I then do it with the kids I work with. So you see something, don't just believe it just because it's out there, check it out. Go to a few reputable sites. You know, just because, you know, your friend Benny said that this is true does not mean it's true. Let's go in and let's look at different sites. Let's look at CNN. Let's look at Washington Post. Let's look at Wall Street Journal even, and see where does this story kind of go, and how do you validate what you're seeing? Because again, just because it's on TikTok does not mean it's true. Just because somebody put a meme, a really creative meme, I wish I was as creative as some of these people, does not mean it's true. So part of what I'm helping the kids do is to use their actual thinking skills, to be cognitive. And let's remember that it's at this time in adolescence, throughout our lives, but especially adolescence, that the frontal lobe is developing. The frontal lobe is right here. It's right behind our eyes. The frontal lobe is where decision-making occurs. Frontal lobe is where executive function occurs. Frontal lobe is where cognition occurs. And so we have to teach them how to do that. So if they're on social media, I'm having conversations with them about it. I'm asking what they're seeing. Because again, if a kid has a phone, they probably are seeing a lot more than you realize. And this is where that conversation again comes in, and it truly is a conversation.
I think that's such an important point. You know, if they're kids are on social media so young, and they're communicating with their friends online now more than ever, even those of us who've kept their kids away from social media. Now that's the only way for them to communicate and play. So it's important for them to be able to sort of navigate that and be able to come to you and ask for advice on, is this true? Is this not true? What should I believe? What should I not believe? But then also, I would love for us to talk just a little bit about how do we talk to our kids and give them the skills so that they're not going into their second grade classroom saying, all the people that voted for this person are dummies, right? Because, like, or just how do we communicate with our kids that, like, sometimes our houses are safe spaces, but not everybody shares those opinions, and how do we help give them guardrails and appropriate social communication, lest they be that child in the classroom.
Right. So part of it actually is what we say at home. Because those of you with kids, you know that they will say what you say. How many of you are like, oh no, I don't curse in front of my kids, and all of a sudden that kid goes out and drops on it, shit. So part of it is, how do we have these conversations around them? What words are we using? Not necessarily, hey honey, don't say this outside, but it's the conversation of, I disagree with what they do. I think that what they did was horrible. I think that what they did was bad. I cannot condone it at all. But then to also teach them, to model for them, how do you have a conversation about something you totally disagree with? And then how can they go into their classroom and still be kind of a good citizen? How can they voice their concerns? Because I don't think it's wrong for a kid to be able to say, I disagree with this. I'm a firm believer in teaching kids to say, I don't want this, I don't like this, for the kid to be able to set their own boundaries. So it's like, how do we then have these conversations and let them know you cannot say these things? But what we do is more of, how do we model it at home? So if the kid comes in and it's like, they're all idiots, I hate them all. Okay, fine. But what are they actually saying and feeling? And then teaching them where's the right place and how to say that. So it's a tricky thing, because to be honest, what occurred on Wednesday should never have occurred. The people that did that, it was a threat to our democracy, a threat to our government, a direct threat to people. I mean, saying hang Mike Pence, the murdering of a police officer, I can't condone it at all. And so I think if we can have the child talk from their perspective of, I can't condone this at all, I saw that and I was disgusted, then there's really nothing wrong with that, I don't think. But I'm also going to have as the kids grow up, I'm also having conversations with them about, how do you handle it when somebody has a differing point of view, and not even politically, but just, if a kid wants to go to school dressed drastically different than the cultural norm, I'm going to stand by that decision for them. But we're also going to have a discussion about, what do you think other kids are going to say and do, and how can you handle that? What are some ways to either answer back or to not internalize somebody else's ignorance?
I see Linda has a question, and I'm going to try to unmute you, Linda. I'm just sending you a message to unmute yourself. And let's see if we can bring you on the line as well. Linda, do you see an option to unmute yourself?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. One of the questions I had was, I had trouble getting on because I went online and then I had to go to Facebook, but that's something I'd like to address later. But one of the things that I'm facing is that I work at a military base, and I'm going to, before this all occurred, we planned on doing a presentation on strengthening parenting skills for parents. And I'm going to have, like, I have no idea. There's several hundred parents out there that may plug in, may not, maybe 3 or 4, maybe 300. But they're going to be talking about this is planned for strengthening parenting skills. A lot of parents have spouses deployed and all, but I'm concerned about this coming up. And so I'm really, struggling with, I have to really walk a fine line here. And my biggest thing that I'm thinking of is like, I think I'm going to go back to the fundamental things that I tell parents. First of all, get in touch with what your feelings are about this. Talk with it to whoever helps you, a family member, a chaplain, one of our other counselors on the basic of me, another person. Get your own self into a state where you're together and then you can discuss it with your child. And then the other thing I was thinking about is just like we tell children, like toddlers, we start with them, we say, it's okay to be angry, but this is what you can do about your anger and this is what you can't do. And so I think that it's like choices of behaviors. And somebody earlier had mentioned about, peaceful demonstrations. And I grew up in the 60s. I'm a flower child, and we demonstrated all the time, but all we did was we carried signs that stated what we felt. We never broke any boundaries. We never shouted or hollered. We didn't carry any weapons. We made our point known, and that was it. And there is room in this country for that kind of behavior to be carried out. And we need to allow children to know that it's not an all or nothing. And I think it's probably going to be a big thing about age appropriateness. I mean, I have a 5-year-old grandson that talks about political issues because he hears everybody talking about differences. And in my family, we did that too. So, and then I have people say, oh, kids don't really talk about politics that much. And I think it goes from home to home and it's also various. But I'd like ideas from people as to I put out what I'm going to do, but I really am open to anybody's thoughts on how they would help parents deal with this, because I think we're all reeling. We all are raw emotionally. This is like a pandemic going on. We're trying to get vaccinated, and then this is going on. It's like I don't know.
Right.
It's like heart surgeons don't have to perform heart surgery if somebody does heart surgery on them at the same time. But that's what we are being asked to do.
Mm-hmm. No, excellent point, Linda. And and for the kids that are the children of military members, I actually am a military brat. My father was career military, so I kind of understand what they're going through. And they have yet that other stressor of if their parent gets deployed. Plus, they saw on TV people dressed as if they were military members, and several former and current members of the military were involved in this in the insurrection that occurred.
And then some of the military are going to go out there to protect against it. And I don't know if on our basis, some of these children and some of these spouses are going to have spouses that are going to be out there who are going to protect.
Yep.
And so it's like.
Yeah, but that leads, so with the military and also with police, part of the conversation with their children is that unfortunately, they oftentimes, or not often, but at times are in harm's way. And at this particular time, they possibly are going to see their parents on TV or seeing the National Guard get deployed. So and again, it goes back to that circle of how do they keep that inner circle as safe as possible? And, we can't lie. We can't sit there and say, hey, things are going to be great. But we can say, let's acknowledge what you're feeling and let's talk about that anger. Let's talk about the distress. Let's are there ways for them to physically get that anger out? Are there ways to make sure their voices are heard and to not be diminished? Because when someone says, oh, don't worry, your daddy will come home or your mom's coming home, that really diminishes their actual fear. Whereas if we can say, hey, tell me about the fear you're feeling. Tell me about what's happening with this. They're going to have a chance to explore it more and thereby then feel safer. So
right.
Cool.
I actually work with children with that constantly and talk about, what they would do when their parent, if that happened, and children have actually had to deal with serious injuries and things like that. And they talk about how they help heal the wounds and how they do this and how they help. And so it's like, what would you do? How would you feel? Who could support you emotionally? Who can support you physically and going through all
Right.
that? I'm just like struggling with this myself because like I just need to walk a fine line. I'm a military family life counselor and I cannot talk about politics, but
Mhm.
uh, this
Right.
is like a national issue. And if parents bring it up, I can't just give this, I call it like almost an ignorant ignorant blank flat out answer. Oh, I can't talk about that. I have to respond emotively to what they're saying. And I think you said it. I'm just going to stay with what they're feeling and get them to get more help and support for that. And then, I think like the safety, children always want to know if they're going to be safe, and
Right.
and their parents are going to be safe, and talk about what they're feeling and what they can do. If anybody else has ideas out there, I'd appreciate it, because I know that other people work with trauma. I work with it day in, day out, constantly.
Mhm.
That's all I do.
All right, cool. Thank you so much, Linda. All right.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And I see several comments here. So I'm actually going to the eye doctor later, so I'm kind of squinting over here at the chats. I see it's Mr. Stoutermeyer has a really great point that white silence equals compliance. Exactly. Like you said, it's imperative that white allies have the courage to speak and learn to address issues of racial inequality. Yes, especially in an educational setting. Like you said, white silence equals compliance. If you aren't aware, then have the humility to learn. What occurred Wednesday has been happening to people of color over and over. I've been addressing issues like this with children since first grade. Yep, thank you. And most definitely to have the humility to learn. That's something I strive for. I can't say I reached perfection, but definitely keep striving towards it.
There's another question that came in from, I believe, David, in terms of how do we tell the children who saw the fires and riots in major cities in the summer, while also telling them what January 6th was wrong? How do we have that conversation and thoughts around that?
I would go back to kind of first, what's the child's actual question with it? And again, developmentally, where are they? If a child's question is, why did we see the National Guard get deployed at Black Lives Matters protest, but we did not see it get deployed at the insurrection? My answer is probably going to be something along the lines of, because we have a lot of systemic racism, and that Black Lives Matter protest was a threat to somebody's perceived power. And therefore those in charge acted this way. And that the insurrection at Washington, D.C. was supported by those in power and was encouraged. So I would probably start there. I would also ask more about what their questions are, what they're seeing. 2020 was just
awful.
Yeah, thank you. That's I was like,
I
can't find a word that actually summarizes 2020. Like Lisa wrote, vandalism, fire setting, assault, murder. We also had I don't know if anybody saw the movie on Netflix, Death to 2020. It was kind of a parody. It's kind of funny, but real all at the same time. And it reminded me of just how much occurred last year, starting with the wildfires in Australia. You got the coronavirus. You got all the election. You got Black Lives Matters movement. You have the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor. You got just horrible, horrible things. So I am talking to kids, like Lisa wrote about universal rights and wrongs. And yeah, I'm going to be talking about that. What occurred was not right. And again, depending on the age of the kid, I work a lot with teenagers, so that's kind of where my mind automatically goes. But it's like, how do I help them now get engaged in their community? How do we help them get to have their voices heard, whether it be going to marches or organizing marches or participating in clubs or organizations through school, not necessarily at school right now, but through school. You know, as they're coming of age, you know, having conversations with 16, 17-year-olds about, well, if you were able to vote in this election, who would you be voting for and why? You know, what are you looking for in a politician? What are you looking for in government? How can your voice be heard? I'm going to try to get them empowered at some level. But I'm also going to do my best to limit their amount of exposure to it. So again, let's not watch the news 24/7. Let's have a time, you know, maybe twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening. So therefore you're not totally ignorant of what's happening. But also watching trusted news sources and having conversations with kids about why do you choose this one versus that one. I saw somebody wrote in, I think David wrote that your daughter showed you a picture of Ocasio-Cortez with the dress with the swastika all over. I mean, that's just horrible. And helping, like I said, kind of helping her differentiate. That's not real news. That's not a real picture. People can Photoshop. Kids are really good at Photoshopping. You know, helping them see that not all the images they see are actually real images, that things can be doctored. You know, it's crazy right now. But again, I'm going to try. My big goal is to have a place where they feel safe and to not feel overwhelmed. One of the things I want to do is help a person get their cortisol levels down. So I do an awful lot of talking with kids about what are you doing for fun? What are we doing for exercise? How are you getting outside? What type of food are you eating? What can we do? You know, can we do deep breathing and meditation? Kids don't like it when I call it deep breathing and meditation. So we find other ways. We blow up balloons. We take straws and try to blow a little paper thing across, but it's anything to get their breathing under control. You know, but again, for kids, I'm trying to help them see that that inner circle is as safe as possible. And now let's build out our outer circle. And how do we have more and more control over ourselves based on who we're inviting into our inner circle and how we're interpreting what we see, and then how active and political can we get involved.
I think that that's such an important thing, and just making sure that we're giving them the tools to control themselves and regulate themselves and then be able to move forward. And I think something also was in the chat box a little earlier, Jeff shared, that's really also super important and necessary to communicate with children that people can do bad things without necessarily being bad people, right? So that while we would all agree that, you know, the man in the Camp Auschwitz shirt was probably a bad person, some of them were there thinking they were doing the right thing. And they may have done things that were bad. They may have different beliefs than us, but we don't necessarily, they don't have to be demonized. They're not all bad people.
Right. All right, well, we are coming up to noon. And unfortunately, I have a client coming at or joining me at noon. So I do need to be wrapping up.
Yep. Well, I thank you so much for your time and sharing the knowledge that you have and just some skills that we can use as parents and as educators, you know, in talking with children and even supporting the children in our schools and in our community groups, et cetera, as they navigate this. It certainly will not be the only challenge I think we'll have in the time where we're definitely going to have more conversations in the days and the weeks to come with our kids. For all of you joining us, thank you so much. It's really great to see so many faces online and to hear from you. Such an important conversation. And we host these community conversations on a variety of topics. So I invite you to stay connected with us and to share them. This will be posted on our website after the event. We've recorded it, so you can share it with friends and families or use it as a resource when you're giving presentations as well. We invite you to do that. Thank you all so much, and I hope you are all healthy and well and managing what is looking and shaping up to be a challenging 2021.
That it is. Hey, thank you,
Thank you so much, Pat.
in participation. I really do appreciate it. All right. Bye, all.
Pat, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thanks.